I can still picture the exact moment my gut sank, not because there were sirens or explosions or anything dramatic like that, but because of silence, that strange, hollow quiet that hits when something familiar is suddenly missing. I was standing barefoot in my driveway, coffee still warm in my hand, staring at a bare slab of concrete where a fully marked patrol car had been parked just a few hours earlier. Lights, decals, radio, city seal, every bit of it gone, like it had never been there at all. And the first thing I felt wasn't anger or fear. It was confusion. A slow, creeping, this can't be right kind of confusion, because police cars don't just vanish by accident. Let me back up, because this story didn't begin with a tow truck. It started with a woman who moved into our neighborhood and decided that reality operated by a special set of rules just for her. My real name isn't Jack, but for the sake of the story, that's what we'll go with. I'm a patrol officer for a mid-sized city police department on the East Coast. I've been doing this job for over 10 years, rotating shifts, miss holidays, birthdays spent in uniform, all of it. Like many departments around the country, we have a take-home vehicle policy. When my shift ends, the car comes home with me, not as a perk, but because it reduces response times and keeps a visible police presence in residential areas. I live in a planned community called Brookstone Meadows, built in the early 2010s. Clean lawns, vinyl fencing, kids riding scooters, retirees walking dogs at sunset. The kind of place where nothing exciting happens, and people prefer it that way. The HOA mostly exists to mow common areas and send out the occasional passive-aggressive newsletter about trash cans or lawn height. I'd lived there for 5 years without a single problem, and everyone knew who I was. Neighbors waved when I pulled in. A few even told me they felt safer knowing a patrol car was nearby. Then Melissa arrived. Not her real name either. But if you've ever dealt with an HOA tyrant, you already know the type. She moved in about 3 houses down, late 40s, always perfectly dressed, radiating clipboard energy even when she wasn't holding one. Within weeks, she started complaining about everything. Kids were too loud. Dogs barked too early. Boats sat in driveways. Work vans stayed overnight. She wasn't just someone who liked rules. She wanted to be the one enforcing them. At first, I barely paid attention. That changed one morning when I walked outside and found a folded note tucked neatly under my windshield wiper. Bright white paper, careful handwriting. Commercial vehicles are prohibited from being parked in residential driveways per HOA regulations. Please remove this vehicle immediately. No name, no signature. Just that tone, the quiet assumption of authority. I remember actually laughing, shaking my head. A marked police cruiser isn't a commercial vehicle. It's a government emergency vehicle, and those are almost always explicitly exempt under HOA bylaws and state law. I crumpled the note, tossed it, and went on with my day. A week later, another note appeared. Same handwriting, same paper, different tone, sharper, more aggressive. Final warning: failure to remove commercial vehicle will result in towing. That one made me pause. Not because I thought she had any legal ground, but because it showed intent. So I did the responsible thing. I called the HOA management company and spoke with the community manager, a guy named Paul. Calm, professional, and clearly worn down by resident drama. I explained everything. He confirmed exactly what I already knew. Police vehicles are not commercial vehicles. They're exempt, and I was allowed to park it there. He even added, almost apologetically, that a new resident had been very vocal about enforcement, but she'd been informed of the exemption and told she had no authority to act. That should have been the end of it. Once HOA management clarifies an issue, residents usually back off. At that point, it's no longer a gray area. It's settled. I assumed Melissa would complain quietly, maybe glare when she drove by, and move on to her next crusade. I was wrong. The night everything fell apart, I worked an overnight shift. I got home just after sunrise, parked the cruiser in my driveway like I'd done hundreds of times before, went inside, showered, and collapsed into bed. When I woke up in the afternoon, groggy and disoriented, I glanced out the front window out of habit, and my brain just froze. No car, no lights, no decals, just empty space. For a moment, I wonder if the department had swapped vehicles for maintenance, which does happen. But there's always a call, a text, some kind of paper trail. I checked my phone. Nothing. I stepped outside and scanned the street, half expecting to see it parked somewhere else. Maybe I'd misremembered. Maybe I was still half asleep. But no, it was gone. I called my supervisor. Hey, did someone pick up my unit? There was a pause on the other end. Then no, why? I told him it wasn't in my driveway. His tone shifted instantly. Stand by. 5 minutes later, he called back. Your vehicle was towed at 11:17 this morning. Private tow. Requested by an HOA representative. That's when the confusion hardened into something colder and heavier. A marked police vehicle had been removed from private property without authorization. This wasn't an HOA dispute anymore. That was a crime. I drove to the tow yard in my personal car, heart racing, rehearsing the conversation in my head. The manager met me at the gate, a middle-aged guy in a sweat-stained polo, clearly used to dealing with angry people, but unaware of what kind of situation he was about to step into. I identified myself, told him my patrol car was inside, and explained it had been taken without authorization. He shrugged and said they received a call from the HOA president about an illegally parked commercial vehicle. I asked if he'd verified her authority or even bothered to confirm what kind of vehicle it was. He admitted they hadn't. They just dispatched the truck. Then he told me I could get the car back after paying the tow and storage fees. That's when I stopped being polite. I explained very clearly that he was currently holding stolen city property, that the vehicle was worth tens of thousands of dollars, and that if it wasn't released immediately, this conversation was about to escalate fast. He made a phone call. His face went pale. Within minutes, the gate opened and my patrol car rolled out, scratched, damaged, humiliated, but returned. When I parked it back in my driveway, the irony wasn't lost on me. The exact same spot had been illegally parked in that morning. As I documented the damage and updated my supervisor, one thing was already obvious. Melissa hadn't just crossed a line. She'd blown right past the warning signs, and she had no idea what was about to hit her. This is the point where it helps to pause the story, because this is also where a lot of people misunderstand how these situations actually work, and it's exactly where Melissa crossed from nuisance into serious trouble. In most HOA-governed communities, enforcement power does not belong to individual residents. Even if someone crowns themselves board president, real authority flows through written bylaws, management companies, and documented notices, not emotions, not grudges, and definitely not anonymous notes left under windshield wipers. From a legal standpoint, an HOA can't just tow vehicles on a whim, especially not from private driveways, and absolutely not when the vehicle involved is a government-owned emergency vehicle that is clearly exempt under both HOA regulations and state law. What happens instead is a psychological trap. A lot of HOA enforcers fall into the illusion of delegated power. They start believing that because they can complain, they can command. And when someone finally tells them no, that boundary doesn't register as law. It registers as disrespect. In Melissa's case, being explicitly told by management that she had no authority didn't stop her. It challenged her sense of identity. And that's where things get dangerous, because when ego replaces procedure, people don't de-escalate. They double down. And here's the part nobody likes to say out loud. Calling a tow company is not a neutral action. It's the initiation of force. You're asking a third party to seize property, remove it, and hold it hostage for money. Legally, that's not enforcement. That's deprivation of property. And once you do that without authority, intent becomes a very big deal. By the next morning, this situation wasn't mine to handle anymore. It officially became the department's problem. And when something crosses that line, the tone shifts fast. I was called into headquarters and sat across from the chief and a captain I'd known for years. The kind of room where nobody needs to raise their voice because authority is already understood. I laid everything out, the notes, my conversation with the HOA manager, the tow yard encounter, the damage to the vehicle. As I spoke, I noticed the chief's jaw tighten, not dramatically, just enough to tell me he was taking this extremely seriously. He didn't interrupt. He didn't steer me. When I finished, he leaned back and said calmly, So someone knowingly ordered a marked patrol vehicle removed from an officer's residence after being told she had no authority to do so. I nodded. He turned to the captain and said, "That's theft of city property." No hesitation. No debate. The meeting ended with a single directive: open an investigation. A detective was assigned that same afternoon. He started exactly where these cases always start: paper trails and phone records. The towing company's dispatch log showed a call placed mid-morning, recorded and time-stamped. The caller identified herself as the HOA president, reported an illegally parked commercial vehicle, and requested immediate removal. No confusion. No inquiry. She didn't ask for clarification. She issued an order. Next, the detective contacted the HOA management company. The manager confirmed in writing that Melissa had been informed police vehicles were exempt, that she had no authority to order a tow, and that enforcement actions had to go through management, not individual board members. That single email carried enormous weight. It erased any argument that this was a misunderstanding. It established knowledge. And once knowledge is proven, everything changes. 3 days after my car vanished, 2 officers knocked on Melissa's door. I wasn't there. I was working a day's shift, but I got the full rundown afterward, and I could picture it clearly. She answered confidently at first. Polite smile, arms crossed, already annoyed that someone had interrupted her afternoon. The detective introduced himself, explained they were investigating a vehicle tow earlier in the week, and asked if she had made the call. She didn't deny it. She justified it. She said the vehicle violated HOA rules. She said commercial vehicles weren't allowed. She said she was enforcing community standards. When the detective asked if she knew it was a police car, she said that didn't matter. When he asked if she'd been told she had no authority, she hesitated, then tried to pivot, claiming her position gave her discretion. That's when the tone changed. He explained, slowly and clearly, that a police cruiser is not a commercial vehicle, that it is city-owned government property, that ordering its removal without authorization constitutes theft, and that the vehicle had sustained damage as a result of that decision. Under standard procedure, once intent and value are established, charges are not optional. They're mandatory. When he cited the statute, explained the value threshold, and used the word felony, the confidence drained from her face. She tried to backpedal. She said she didn't steal anything. She just made a call. Legally, that distinction doesn't exist. Causing property to be taken is the same as taking it yourself. She had initiated the chain of events knowing she wasn't allowed to, and that made her responsible for every consequence that followed. She was arrested on the spot. Handcuffs, patrol car, neighbors watching from behind blinds. The entire scene unfolding on the same quiet street she'd been so desperate to control. The charge was felony theft of government property, based on the value of the vehicle. Her attorney later tried to frame it as overreach, an honest mistake, a misunderstanding of HOA authority, but the evidence didn't cooperate. The recorded tow request, the HOA email explicitly warning her, the exemption language in the bylaws, the damage report, all of it lined up. The prosecution didn't need to dramatize a single detail. They simply had to present the facts in sequence. In court, the prosecutor was direct and unapologetic. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't ignorance. This was a deliberate disregard for clearly defined boundaries, driven by a need to assert control. The fact that her actions interfered with a police officer's ability to respond to emergencies only made things worse. That point landed hard. Juries understand inconvenience. They don't forgive risks to public safety. Faced with that reality, Melissa accepted a plea deal. The felony charge was reduced, but the fallout was still very real. Jail time, probation, restitution for the damage to the vehicle and the towing costs, fines, community service. This wasn't a symbolic slap on the wrist. It was disruptive. It altered her life in ways she clearly hadn't imagined when she picked up the phone, thinking she was teaching someone a lesson. Once the arrest became public, the HOA board moved fast. They stripped her of any leadership role, issued a formal written apology to me and to the department, and circulated a notice clarifying enforcement procedures and exemptions. The kind of document that usually only exists because someone, somewhere, ignored common sense and forced everyone else to clean up the mess. A new board president was elected, a retired first responder who understood both authority and restraint. He came by personally to apologize, not because policy required it, but because he believed it mattered. Melissa served part of her sentence, was released on probation, and within weeks, her house went up for sale. She stopped attending HOA meetings. The notes on windshields disappeared. Not long after that, she left the state entirely. The neighborhood settled back into its usual quiet, not because it was being tightly controlled, but because the tension had finally drained away. The city also reviewed the tow company's practices. They weren't criminally charged, but they lost their contract rotation for failing to verify authority before towing a clearly marked government vehicle. That's how accountability is supposed to work. Not scorched earth, but correction paired with consequences. As for me, I kept parking my patrol car in the driveway. Same spot, same routine. A few fresh scratches underneath, serving as a reminder that escalation doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it starts small, with a folded note, and the belief that rules exist to serve your ego. By the time everything's settled, paperwork filed, contracts reviewed, new names printed on HOA letterhead, the neighborhood felt normal again, but not in quite the same way. It was quieter, yes, but it was also more honest. People stopped assuming authority came from confidence alone. They started asking questions instead of issuing demands. And that's really where the story ends. Not with the arrest, not with the sentence, but with the lesson underneath it all. Rules without restraint turn into weapons. HOAs are meant to manage shared spaces, not to satisfy personal grudges or power fantasies. When someone confuses proximity to authority with actual authority, they don't just create conflict, they create liability. Melissa didn't wake up one morning planning to commit a felony. She woke up wanting control. She convinced herself the ends justified the means. That making a phone call was harmless. That someone else would carry the responsibility. That belief is incredibly common, and it's why situations like this keep happening. Legally, this case is a textbook example of why intent matters more than intent to harm. She didn't need to want to hurt anyone. She only needed to know she wasn't allowed to do what she did, and do it anyway. That's the line the law cares about. Causing property to be seized, moved, and damaged doesn't become legal just because you weren't the one holding the tow hook. The law looks at causation, not vibes. There's also a psychological layer worth sitting with. This is a trap people fall into when they feel powerless elsewhere in their lives. They cling to a narrow lane where they're allowed to say no, and they defend it aggressively because it becomes part of who they are. When someone challenges that lane, even politely, it doesn't feel like disagreement. It feels like disrespect. That's when escalation starts to feel justified. People stop seeing other humans. They start seeing obstacles. For anyone living in an HOA, whether you love it or hate it, the takeaway is simple. Know the limits of your authority. And if you don't have it, don't borrow it. Enforcement is a process, not a mood. If you're on a board, your job isn't to win. It's to follow procedure, especially when you're annoyed. And for law enforcement officers, firefighters, EMS, or anyone with a take-home vehicle, this is a reminder that visibility cuts both ways. Most communities appreciate it. A few resent it. If you face pushback, document everything. Involve management early. Never assume common sense will save you. It won't. Paper trails will. What stayed with me wasn't the arrest or the courtroom. It was how quickly a quiet neighborhood turned into a criminal case because one person refused to accept no as a complete sentence. Control feels powerful until it costs you something real. Freedom, money, reputation. Sometimes all three. So if you're watching this and thinking about that note you almost left on someone's windshield, or that call you were about to make to teach them a lesson, stop. Ask yourself whether you're enforcing a rule or feeding an ego. The line between those two is thinner than most people realize. And once you cross it, you don't get to decide how far the consequences go. If you've ever dealt with an HOA dispute that spiraled out of control or watched a power trip collapse in spectacular fashion, share your story. These conversations matter. The more people understand where authority actually comes from, the less likely they are to misuse it. And if you want more stories where ordinary decisions collide with real-world consequences, you know what to do.